All right, deep divers, ready to head back to World War II. Buckle up, because today we're diving into the Pacific theater, talking about the heavy hitters, the big daddies of the ocean, American versus Japanese aircraft carriers. I mean, picture this 1942, the Pacific sprawling out in front of you, the battleship era. Yeah, that's yesterday's news. Now it's all about these behemoths, these floating fortresses, aircraft carriers. And lucky for us, our source, Titans of the Pacific, well, it's jam-packed with details about this clash. But it doesn't just tell us what happened, it digs into the why, the how. One thing that really struck me right off the bat was how different the US and Japan were in their whole approach to carrier design. It's like they had completely different philosophies driving them from the get-go, wouldn't you say?
Oh, absolutely. The source makes that crystal clear right from the beginning. It's like this, the Americans, they built their carriers like those heavyweight boxers.
Yeah.
Tough built to last. Armored flight decks, state-of-the-art damage control systems. These ships were made to take a punch and keep on ticking.
And when you think about the distances involved in the Pacific, it makes sense. We're talking thousands of miles these carriers had to travel. They had to be ready for anything.
Exactly. The source even mentions how some American carriers, after doing their duty in the Pacific, they patch them up and send them right over to the Atlantic. Unbelievable. They needed that toughness, that go-the-distance mentality.
No.
Now the Japanese, whole different ballgame. Their carriers, those were more like fencers, nimble, quick, deadly.
Yeah, it's like they were all about speed and hitting hard, even if it meant sacrificing some of that American-style brute strength. But why such a difference? Was it just about resources, do you think?
Resources definitely played a part. But the Titan source, it digs a little deeper, and I think it points to a fundamental difference in strategy. You see, the Japanese, at least early on, they were all about that decisive quick strike. They wanted to cripple the enemy fast with overwhelming force, shock, and awe.
So their carriers were built for that knockout punch, speed, firepower. That was the name of the game. But did that go for the jugular strategy? Did that affect how they trained their pilots too?
Absolutely, and this is where the contrast gets really fascinating. The source highlights how much the U.S. invested not just in training their pilots, but in rescuing them too, bringing them home whenever possible. They even invented this crazy contraption called the Dilbert Dunker. It simulated underwater escapes from a downed aircraft.
The Dilbert Dunker. Sounds intense.
It was, but it shows you how differently the Americans were thinking. They knew every skilled pilot was precious. Losing a plane was bad enough, but losing a veteran pilot, that was a serious blow.
Makes sense. So you've got these two very different carrier designs, different training philosophies even, but how did that actually play out in a real fight? I mean, a carrier is just a sitting duck without its crew and its planes, right?
Exactly, and that's where we really see these design philosophies translate into battle tactics. This wasn't just about individual ships duking it out anymore. It was about how those ships were used, how they worked together. It was about naval warfare evolving right in front of our eyes.
So we've seen these carriers were built like totally different warriors, right? But that design, that was just the start, their battlefield use, how they were deployed, their doctrines, that's where things get even more interesting.
Yeah, and Titans of the Pacific, it really digs into that.
Like it lays it all out.
And one thing that's important to remember with those sturdy American carriers is that they developed this whole idea of the carrier task force.
All right, so break that down for me. What are we talking about here?
Basically, picture this. You got your carrier right, but it's not alone, not just one ship going solo. It's part of a whole team, a pack of warships working together like a well-oiled machine.
Okay, so a coordinated effort.
Exactly. You've got cruisers, destroyers, all there to protect the carriers, screen them from attack. And the carriers themselves, they're coordinating their air attacks.
So it's like a big coordinated dance of destruction, each ship with a specific part to play.
Right, and the source, it gives this great example. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, they called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot.
Turkey shoot. Yikes, that sounds pretty one-sided.
It was, and a lot of it came down to the American Task Force doctrine working exactly how it was supposed to.
Okay, so how did it all go down?
Basically, their carriers working together, they were picking up Japanese planes on radar while they were still way out there.
They could see them coming before they could even see them.
That's right, long-range detection, long-range engagements, it was a massacre.
But to coordinate like that across all those ships back in the 1940s, that had to require some pretty impressive comms, right?
Absolutely, and Titans highlights another key difference here. The U.S., they'd really gone all in on radio technology.
So they could actually talk to each other in real time.
Pretty much, which is amazing when you think about it back then. This whole other level of coordination, it changed everything.
It sounds like the Japanese, on the other hand, they were still more about each ship, each squadron doing its own thing.
In the beginning, yeah. And while they did adapt as things got tougher, They never quite embraced the whole task force idea the way the Americans did.
Interesting. So it wasn't enough just to have powerful ships. It was about how you used them, how you wove them into the larger strategy.
Exactly. And there are even some historians who argue that cultural factors played a role too.
Oh, really? Like what?
Well, some say the Japanese military at the time placed a higher value on individual skill and initiative. Maybe that made them slower to adopt the kind of top-down coordination the U.S. was using.
Fascinating stuff. So we've got these two completely different approaches to using carriers on the strategic level. But what about the guys actually flying the planes? We touched on how the U.S. really prioritized training and rescue, but how did that actually translate to the experience of being, say, a Navy pilot for the Americans versus the Japanese?
It's a great question, and it's something Titans of the Pacific really brings to light. On the American side, there was this real emphasis on preserving their experienced pilots, bringing them home whenever possible.
Yeah, like those guys were gold.
Exactly. They had a long-term view of things. They knew a seasoned pilot, a veteran, was a huge asset. You didn't just throw him away.
Whereas the Japanese, it sounds like their pilots were facing tougher and tougher odds as the war went on.
Yeah, sadly that's true. They started out with this core of incredibly skilled pilots, real veterans. But as they took losses, they were forced to rely on younger, less experienced replacements.
And I bet that, combined with their less forgiving doctrine, meant those Japanese pilots were in an increasingly impossible situation.
Yeah, it's heartbreaking when you think about it. Titans doesn't dwell on it too much, but you can really sense the pressure those pilots were under on both sides.
Absolutely. So we're seeing how these different philosophies, these different approaches to technology, they didn't just play out on the strategic level, they had a real human cost too.
For sure. And this is where I think our discussion of technology really comes full circle, right? Because these differences in technology in industrial capacity, those weren't just abstract concepts. They had a direct impact on the lives of the sailors on board those carriers.
And that impact, that human side of the equation, that's where we're headed next. It's easy to get caught up in all the big picture stuff, the carriers, the planes, the battles, but we can't forget there were actual people living and fighting on those ships.
Absolutely. Titans of the Pacific, it doesn't really focus on individual stories too much, but you can still get a sense of the human cost of this technological gap we've been talking about.
Yeah, I mean, we've talked about the American industrial machine, how they could churn out ships and planes, but how did that translate to the experience of being on board one of those carriers?
Well, the source mentions that American sailors, especially as the war went on, they had it relatively good, actually.
Really? Like, what does that even mean, relatively good, in the middle of the Pacific War?
Well, for one thing, they had decent living conditions, even some creature comforts. There's even a part in there about them making ice cream on board some of the bigger carriers.
Ice cream? Seriously? That's why, I mean, talk about surreal.
Right. It seems strange, but I think it speaks volumes about the American mindset at the time. They knew that keeping morale up, taking care of their sailors' basic needs, even in a war zone, it was important.
Yeah, and meanwhile, the Japanese carriers?
Yeah, not so much. The source paints a much bleaker picture on that side. As the war dragged on, things got really rough for them. Remember those fuel shortages we talked about?
Oh, yeah, and the dwindling industrial output?
Yeah, exactly. Well, that all trickled down to the sailors on the front lines. Rations were cut, fatigue was constant, and of course the threat of air attacks never really went away.
I bet that took a toll on morale.
Huge toll. The source even mentions how some of the Japanese sailors, especially those who had been serving since the early victories, they started to feel like they were being forgotten, left behind as the tide turned against them.
Man, that's rough. It really makes you think about the human cost of war on both sides.
It does. And it reminds us that victory, especially in a long, drawn-out conflict like the Pacific War, it's not just about having superior firepower. It's about the will of the people fighting the ones who can endure the hardship and hold on to hope.
Really powerful stuff. And I think that's a perfect note to end on. You've given us a lot to think about today.
My pleasure. It's been great diving into this with you.
And for our listeners out there, if you want to learn more about this clash of titans in the Pacific, be sure to check out Titans of the Pacific yourself. You won't be disappointed. It's a fascinating look at a pivotal moment in history, and who knows, maybe it'll even spark some of your own deep dives. Until next time, deep divers keep exploring.